Billy Knoll is a 65-year-old military veteran enjoying his retirement.
Billy was my older brother. I like to say he was the go-to guy. If you needed anything, you wanted anything, he would give you the shirt off his back. Billy had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. He lived for his children. You know, that's what he woke up to do.
My grandfather's always been the one solid male figure in me and my sister and my brother's life that was always there.
I moved in with Billy in 2012. My kids had grown, and so I called him and said, "Can I come stay with you?" And he said, "Yeah, come in, stay as long as you want." I really loved the opportunity to be there, especially when he was diagnosed with cancer. He didn't accept help. You know, he'd be crawling on the floor before he asked for help. But I was glad I was able to be there during that time.
Billy finishes his cancer treatment in May 2015. Mary moves out to make room for Sadie and her family to move in.
He never made me feel like it was a bad idea, but the house wasn't big enough for everybody, so I moved out.
He finally finished his chemo treatment and everything was going well, and we all celebrated.
He always walked to help him sleep. He walked to think, and he would just walk for hours.
He just couldn't sleep that night. We as a family 100% believe that that's what was going on. He had his music in and everything.
What's the address of the emergency?
Hello, there's a man lying here on the corner of 1st and St. Louis. He does not appear to be breathing, and he is bleeding uncontrollably.
Okay, we're gonna get help on the way. Hold on 1 second for me. Do you know why he's bleeding?
No, I have no idea. I just saw him lying here on the sidewalk as I was driving by, and I thought I'd pull over to see if he's doing okay, and he just, I don't know what to do. I'm just a little freaked out right now.
Okay. All right, we do have help on the way.
On June 3rd of 2015, I was the on-call investigator for the city of Loveland. I was paged to contact the street supervisor in reference to a death investigation at the corner of 1st and St. Louis in Loveland. The 911 call was placed by a gentleman who was driving through the area. He was coming home from work, and he saw a person lying on the northwest corner of 1st and St. Louis. He stopped to check on that person and found him to be unresponsive and bleeding. The on-call duty supervisor told me over the phone that the victim appeared to have been shot multiple times. It appeared, based on the way he was clothed at the time, it appeared that maybe he was just out for a walk. The victim was identified by a colored driver's license that he had in his wallet. And on that driver's license is his full name, William Knoll. So when I arrived on scene that evening, one of my officers had located what's called a shot cup that comes from a shotgun lying close to the victim. And that got us looking into the possibility that the victim was shot with a shotgun.
Doesn't even make sense. Why would someone, out of everybody, take my papa's life?
The victim himself didn't appear to have been robbed. He was listening to something on his phone. He had earbuds in, glasses on, hat on. The shot cup was located just a little north of the victim. And there was also one pellet hole in the side of the building, which would have been just north of the victim. Obviously, this type of crime in Loveland is not a normal one. If we did have a suspect that was randomly shooting people, we knew that was a major concern for us. And that was due to the fact that there were other random shootings in the area in the last several months.
In April 2015, an unknown gunman shot 20-year-old Corey Romero following a road traffic accident in Fort Collins. Corey survived her wound. In May 2015, 47-year-old John Jacoby was shot and killed while riding his bicycle in Windsor. Loveland PD reaches out to the Northern Colorado Shooting Task Force after what appears to be a third random shooting in as many months.
Detective Kamoski asked if I would go through the scene with him to see if there were any similarities.
Thanks for coming.
We were able to find out fairly quickly that there was no connection between either of the three victims, which stood out in our minds that it was somebody randomly going around shooting at people, which was concerning, to say the least.
Can you tell me what you saw earlier this evening?
I had an officer who found a witness down the street. The witness was in her home, actually in her bathroom at the time, and her window faces North St. Louis, which would be the road that goes north out of the intersection. She hears a loud noise, which she contributes to being a gunshot. Prompts her to look out the window, and she sees what she describes as an older style pickup truck traveling northbound at a high rate of speed. It was a long bed, single cab. She also thought that it was two-toned and that it sounded loud, like maybe it had a muffler problem. Once my officers canvassed the area, there was a liquor store on the southeast corner of the intersection, and one of my officers observed several cameras on the outside of the building. The owner of that business was contacted, and he was able to show us his surveillance video. We were hoping that we would capture the actual crime as it occurred, which would be obviously invaluable to us.
Play me the footage from around 10:30 p.m.
The surveillance video was a little grainy. There wasn't a lot of detail.
Pause it there.
At 10:41, we see Mr. Cano walking west on 1st Street.
Play that section again, please.
He approaches the crosswalk area of the intersection and then goes out of frame.
Hold it. Show me that again.
So approximately 30 seconds after Mr. Cano leaves the frame of the video, you can see a pickup come into frame.
Again, please.
The vehicle was traveling at a slower rate of speed than the other vehicles going through the intersection.
Okay, punch in there.
It also was a single-cabbed, long bed, older-looking truck, and that matched what the witness had told us.
But it does look like a older model or a 70s model GMC Chevy type pickup. We kept focusing and seeing what we believed were some rust spots on the driver's door. Obviously, it matched up with the time that Mr. Cano was shot. You can see the pickup in question going westbound on First Street just as Mr. Knoll is ready to cross the street.
Hold on, that's the same truck from earlier.
Show me that again, please.
About a minute later, you can see the same pickup come back into frame, and then the pickup turns north onto St. Louis.
Why would that truck double back so soon?
He goes up 3 or 4 blocks and takes some side streets. Became significant because we were able to get more witness information that they heard a vehicle with a loud engine come down their street.
When we see the vehicle, which we believe is the same vehicle twice, at a close proximity of time when the actual murder occurs, that was highly significant for us, and it really started to get us to think that this vehicle was possibly involved.
We put out a be on the lookout for a Chevrolet or GMC pickup truck. We were able to give a pretty good description of the vehicle on the be on the lookout to other law enforcement agencies.
The following day, we put out a press release. We were looking for, a possibility that somebody out there would know something or seen something. I was aware of the fact that there was the 2 other shootings. One of them, the victim died. The other one, I knew miraculously survived her injuries. And based on the fact that up until this point in my investigation, I hadn't been able to establish a motive, it was natural for me to start to consider the fact that these incidents could be tied together.
As the task force investigates possible links between the shootings, the results from Billy's autopsy come through.
On June 7th, we were told that Mr. Knoll had died of a shotgun wound to his upper torso. It was from a 12-gauge shotgun.
We were able to determine through some testing of similar shotgun shells, the discharge site and the pattern that it produced, that it was a distance of probably between 22 and 27 foot, which would have put the shooters basically in the middle of First Street. Plausible that it came from a vehicle because of a downward angle.
The comparisons to the other 2 shootings were, we believe those victims were shot from a moving vehicle. We believe Mr. Knoll was shot from a moving vehicle.
So based off of the video that we had and the one eyewitness that we had, the next investigative part of the case would be to try and find 73 to 79 years GM pickups. So we were able to access the Colorado Division of Motor Vehicles database and ask for that particular range of year, style of pickup, and make of pickup. We then are given a list of those vehicles that would match that criteria. Unfortunately, that was thousands and thousands and thousands of vehicles. There was anywhere from 30 to 50 people working every day on the case, and there was probably 12 to 15 of us that would go out every day and look for potential suspect vehicles.
While investigators look for the vintage truck, Detective Kamoski receives information about another shooting.
I get a phone call from Mr. Chronister.
Detective Kamoski speaking.
Mr. Chronister reports to me that approximately 10 minutes prior to the time that Mr. Knoll was shot and killed, he had been shot at by an unknown person driving a orange or red-colored pickup truck.
Mr. Chronister was leaving a bar on the north side of Berthoud. He observed a pickup that was parked on the side of the road with its lights out. As he turned left, the pickup turned on its headlights and began to pursue him. He went to the area of his residence. He said the pickup was still very, very close to him. Just as he was turning left at 10:33 p.m., he heard what he believed to be a gunshot. He reached and felt his back to make sure he had not been hit, and that he immediately went home.
Thank you very much.
It was a huge concern to us to find out that there could be a second shooting. Potentially, I had a suspect that was out randomly shooting people, and in a way, for me, it almost appeared as if he's out hunting people. We canvassed that whole route in which Mr. Chronister took all the way up until the time that he was shot at. And we were able to locate a surveillance video camera. Unfortunately, the surveillance video is from atop of a roof of a Walmart. It was pretty far away.
Investigators review the CCTV footage at the police department.
Play me the footage from June 3rd, 10:30 p.m.
We were hoping we would be able to see license plates and things like better description of the vehicle and possibly even who's driving the vehicle.
The security camera is such a distance away that the vehicles that are traveling on the roadway that we're interested in are fairly small. So we knew right away we weren't going to be able to get a lot of detail. You can see in the video that you can make out what appears to be a motorcycle traveling northbound on Denver Avenue. You can see a vehicle directly behind that motorcycle. Potentially could be a huge piece of evidence. So at approximately 10:33 p.m., we see what we believe is Mr. Chronister on his motorcycle, and then directly behind him, we see the suspect vehicle.
Rewind 10 seconds and play it back again.
As the two vehicles travel northbound and get closer to the intersection of Denver Avenue and Eisenhower Boulevard, it becomes a bit more lit.
Stop there. Zoom in, please.
And that's where we get our first glimpse that you can see the color of it, which appears to be either a red or an orange. One of my detectives received a call from a gentleman who lived 3 blocks north of the shooting location. He happened to be up that night and reports that he gets a very good look at the vehicle as it goes by. So that witness was brought to the police department. While I'm doing an interview with him, I drew a pickup truck as he described it.
How about now?
And then that composite of that truck was then used later on in a press release.
Investigators enlist the help of the FBI to hunt for physical evidence.
Based on Mr. Chronister's cooperation, he agreed to meet Detective Kamoski with members of the FBI evidence recovery team. They all went back to that location at East 18th and Allen Park.
The evidence recovery team was able to recover wadding, along with 2 shotgun pellets from the area of Allendale Park. Those pellets were consistent with the same pellets that were recovered from the body of William Cano.
And for investigative purposes, that was enough for us to know that the attempted murder of Mr. Chronister and the murder of Mr. Cano were related.
The other two shootings that we were also investigating of Corey Romero and John Jacoby, we knew the MO correlated almost exactly. A person walking or driving a vehicle being shot at from a moving vehicle. That was a major mindset behind the task force at the time, that we had a serial shooter out there.
So at this point in the investigation, we were still looking at a lot of pickup trucks. It was determined that maybe the best course of action would be to contact General Motors directly.
So in December of 2015, we sent the video of the truck going through the intersection to a GMC headquarters in Detroit.
Yep, it's right there.
The staff member there took a look at that video, and because of certain markings on the truck, the year span was now something like 1982 to 1989, and not 1973 to 1979.
We had been looking for so long for 70s, and we're so confident that we were looking in the right year range.
So that prompted a updated press release, and we had to go back and recheck everything using that new criteria.
Nobody went outside, not at nighttime. Nobody let their kids play in the front yard without being watched anymore. Like, you had to watch your back, and you had to watch each other's back, because you didn't know. And it was really scary. I was almost certain it was going to be a very long time before they caught him.
We thought we might just have to accept that they won't find him, that this will just have to be part of our lives, which is a tough thing to have to come to terms with.
In April 2017, one of the investigators assigned to the task force received information from a third party that he knew, reported that they worked at a bank in Loveland and that an individual had called and threatened the bank because he believed that the bank had stolen some money from him.
Find it or you're all dead. You hear me? Dead.
Where that ties into our investigation is that when we released the composite sketch of the suspect vehicle years earlier, the bank employees had seen that.
And when these bank tellers were questioned further, they brought up the fact that, yes, the individual used to drive a beat-up orange Chevy truck, and it had a loud engine. We ran the license plate on the vehicle, and we got a hit. The license plate came back to Christopher Parker as the owner.
That is the first time that we get any information on a person by the name of Christopher Parker. We believe that he does have access to weapons, which would heighten the way that we would respond.
The Loveland Police Department SWAT team to set up a perimeter on the house. Mr. Parker, while he was in the house, reached out to his mother, and she got on the phone and spoke to the mental health providers.
The Loveland Police Department SWAT team subsequently arrest him on a mental health hold. And while he was being transported to the hospital, he asked to speak to the Loveland Police Department. So I was requested to go to speak with Mr. Parker. Obviously, we asked Mr. Parker if he could remember where he was the day and the evening of the shooting with Mr. Knoll. However, he talked about being on his bike all day, riding around for like 14 hours, which just seemed to be highly improbable. I didn't really think that we would get a lot of information from him because that was, 2 years earlier. Mr. Parker was a difficult person to interview and keep on task. He was kind of talking in circles.
That particular interview did not turn out well. There was no information provided about the crime. And he asked for an attorney and the interview was over.
Investigators secure a warrant to examine Christopher Parker's garage.
So, doing a search of the vehicle, we've located that Mr. Parker had purchased that vehicle on April 9th, 2015. Several months before the Knoll homicide. The previous owner of the vehicle registered the vehicle as a red Chevrolet pickup truck.
And now the vehicle was painted white, but that it was such a low quality paint job that you could still see the orange paint coming through the white paint.
So when we were able to look at Mr. Parker's truck and examine it closer, it was obvious that Mr. Parker's truck used to be red or orange. You could see the color underneath the white paint that was on it. You also could look at the application of the white paint on the truck, and it was apparent that it was rushed and not painted very well. I knew right away that was it. I could just tell that that was the truck. That was the first time I was really excited about the case and knew that we had something pretty big. Our team members, the searchers, come back and tell me they located a gallon of Rust-Oleum paint that was white. And then also located in the garage was 19 cans of used white spray paint. That also seemed to match with what we were seeing as far as his vehicle was concerned. Mr. Parker's truck was not manufactured as white, it was actually red, and it's now changed colors after the shooting occurred with Mr. Knoll. So that was something that we were very interested in. Based on what we located during the search warrant, the initial interview with Mr. Parker at the hospital, I was fairly confident that we were looking at our killer.
However, in these investigations, there's a big difference of believing and proving it in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And it was all very circumstantial at this time.
Excuse me, sir. Yeah. You gotta see this.
All right.
One of the next steps in the investigation is to try to locate the social media postings for Mr. Parker, especially historical ones, trying to go back and see what he was posting at the time of the shootings. So directly after the composite drawing came out of the pickup truck, Mr. Parker posted a comment on his social media, something to the effect of everybody paint your pickup trucks white. I thought that was an important part of our case. Mr. Parker felt it necessary to paint his truck a different color right after the public got to see what the suspect truck looked like.
In February 2018, Christopher Parker's mother calls Loveland police again.
His mother says that she's alarmed for his safety, that she's afraid that he's going to hurt him or someone in the house.
Mr. Parker had actually left me a message on my desk phone. I called him back, and he told me that he wanted to come in and talk with me. When I interviewed Mr. Parker, he then talks about purchasing a shotgun from a local Walmart, but then had given it back the day he had purchased it. During the interview, Mr. Parker becomes very animated. He gets very agitated. At one point in time, he jumps up in the room as if he's going to punch me. So we decide at that time it's probably best to not interview him any further. He then was transported again to the local hospital for a mental health evaluation.
Following that interview, we sent another investigator to Walmart at Denver and Eisenhower.
Hello, sir. I need to look at your firearms purchases from 2015. Thank you.
We looked at their 2015 purchases of firearms and found a record that he had indeed purchased a shotgun in January of 2015, and that in addition of purchasing this shotgun, he had signed a form declaring that he knew that there was a no return policy.
And that was a key piece of evidence for us because Mr. Parker talks about the fact that he didn't have the weapon, that he returned it, and we knew that not to be true.
I asked Investigator Gillum to go purchase an exact make, model that has all the specifications that this shotgun had. He did that. It turned out to be an 18-inch, 12-gauge shotgun that was designed to be used in close quarters, something that would very well fit inside a vehicle without the barrel going outside the window. And he conducted test fires on this shotgun using a 3-inch, 12-gauge shell. On the shells that he test fired, the striations were consistent and matched the striations on the shotgun wadding that was found at the crime scene next to Mr. Knoll's body. It was the missing piece that we needed. The district attorney was comfortable enough in issuing an arrest warrant for Mr. Parker. After obtaining the arrest warrant, we wanted to take him into custody when he was by himself.
2 years and 9 months after the shooting with Mr. Knoll, we arrest Mr. Parker without incident on a traffic stop. Once we arrest a suspect, we will monitor their jail calls. And what we're hoping for there is they say something to somebody that would be pertinent for the investigation. In this case, while Mr. Parker was in custody, he has a jail call with his biological father who lives in Florida.
I know, but they don't have one gun on me. They don't have anything.
His father confronts Christopher about the case, asks him if he's involved, and makes some comments about the fact that the police, have his truck, they have his gun, they have the shells.
I don't know how they have any evidence. They have none. They have no gun, no shells, no proof that I did it.
And Christopher makes a comment back to his father that we don't have the shells. That was a key statement for us, especially about the shells, because there was no information put out about the fact of whether or not we located shells or not at the scene.
Christopher Parker is brought from jail to the sheriff's office for questioning.
Well, my name is Bob Coleman. I'm with the sheriff's office. This is Todd. He works with me. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. And the reason you're here is because you're under arrest.
We weren't going to let him talk in circles like he had previously. We were going to confront him with what we knew. And so that's what we did.
I didn't murder anybody. The guy was live on film after the truck drove by. And then what happened then, bud?
The guy was looking on his phone, and I looked over. I said hi to him. He said hi, and he waved to me.
And then he talks about the fact that Mr. Knoll was holding his phone and that he was wearing earbuds. That information was never released to the public. Only the shooter would know that information.
Mr. Parker is booked on a charge of murder in the first degree.
Christopher Parker later accepts a deal to plead guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder for killing Billy Knoll.
Mr. Parker received a 39-year prison sentence. That's a substantial sentence for him to carry out.
Prosecutors charged Parker with no crime in relation to the shooting incident involving Donald Chronister.
When the district attorneys talked with Mr. Parker's attorneys, they just came to an agreement that they would stick with the second-degree murder charge, that they would drop the attempted first-degree murder charge, and both sides agreed to the terms.
Investigators clear Parker of any involvement in the shootings of Corey Romero and John Jacoby.
During all this work, we were not able to find any evidence whatsoever linking Mr. Parker to the shooting that occurred in April and linking him to the shooting that occurred in May. I'd say that although the shooting in April and May have not been solved yet, I feel that they will be someday.
Investigators can only speculate about what drove Christopher Parker to murder Billy Knoll.
It's my belief that he was copycatting the first two shootings, and that's the night he chose to do it, and that he left his residence with that shotgun that he had purchased from Walmart, and that he was determined to shoot and kill someone. Came across Mr. Knoll, and his actions of going westbound and then turning around and going eastbound tells me that he made the intentional decision to turn around and shoot at Mr. Knoll because he was a stationary, close target, and his chances of succeeding were much higher. The video sent us down the right path and basically led to the arrest and conviction of Mr. Parker.
When Christopher Parker killed my brother, he took away what could have been and created a great deal of chaos and pain, generations of pain, generations of trauma.
I will say I recently spoke to Mary, and she did inform me that she got a bunch of donations from Grandpa's college peers and everything, and they put together enough donations to get a bench put down for him at Regis's college that he graduated from, and that makes my heart just so unbelievably happy. My grandpa was definitely my idol. Even though he's not with us, I still look up to him. He showed me a great example of who to be and how to treat others. And for that, I thank him every day for it.
Next time on See No Evil.
911, what's the emergency? I was very scared.
The video was what broke the case. Now they're murderers. Now the stakes are much more higher for them.
The snow had already started to fall when they found the car. Not abandoned in the way you'd expect, no shattered glass, no signs of a struggle, no doors left ajar like a silent scream. It was parked. Neatly. Precisely. as if whoever left it believed they would be back in minutes. The engine was cold. The keys were gone. And inside, on the passenger seat, sat a single object that would haunt investigators for decades, a tape recorder. Colorado, winter of 1999. A place where silence stretches for miles and the mountains swallow sound whole. A place where a disappearance can dissolve into the landscape, leaving behind nothing but questions. That morning, a highway patrol officer spotted the vehicle along a desolate stretch of road just outside a small town, one of those communities where everyone knows everyone, and nothing unusual goes unnoticed. Except this. The license plate came back within minutes. Registered to a 27-year-old woman. Local. No criminal record. No history of disappearing acts. No reason, none anyone could immediately identify, for her to vanish without a trace. But she had. The name spread through the town like a shockwave. Friends called her reliable. Neighbors described her as quiet but warm. Co-workers said she never missed a shift. No signs of distress. No recent conflicts. No warnings. Just gone. And the only thing left behind that tape recorder. When officers played it for the first time, the room went still. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faint breathing. Slow. Uneven. As if whoever held the device was trying not to be heard. Seconds stretched. Then a voice, barely above a whisper. Not hers. Male. Calm. Controlled. And chillingly close. No names were spoken. No clear threats. Just fragments. Half sentences. The kind that feel ordinary until you realize they're not. Until you hear what's behind them. Until you understand that this may be the last thing she ever recorded. The tape cut off abruptly. No struggle. No scream. Just silence. That was the moment the case stopped being a missing person report and became something else entirely. Something darker. Something colder. A cold case before it even had time to cool. Investigators moved fast in those early hours. The area around the car was combed inch by inch. Snow made it difficult, footprints blurred, evidence buried before it could even be documented. Search teams expanded outward, grid by grid, scanning the surrounding forest, the ditches, the frozen riverbanks. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing through the heavy air. Dogs were brought in, noses low, tracking a scent that seemed to fade just beyond the roadside. There was nothing. No blood. No signs of a struggle. No drag marks. No indication she had been forced into another vehicle. Just that car. That recorder. And the unsettling sense that something had happened but not here. Interviews began immediately. Family. Friends. Co-workers. Anyone who might have seen her in the hours before she disappeared. The timeline was tight. She had left work late that evening. Told a colleague she was heading home. Nothing unusual in her tone. No hint of fear. No sign she was being followed. But she never made it. Witnesses along the highway reported nothing out of the ordinary. No stalled vehicles. No suspicious figures. No roadside encounters. Just the usual quiet traffic of a winter night. Then came the first crack in the surface. A gas station clerk, miles back along her route, remembered her. Said she came in around 9:30 p.m. Bought a bottle of water. Paid in cash. But something about her seemed off. Distracted. Like she was listening for something. Or someone. When asked if she was alone, the clerk hesitated. He wasn't sure. He thought he saw another car pull in shortly after. Dark-colored. Parked a few spaces away. The driver never came inside. Just sat there. Engine running. Lights off. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Investigators pulled surveillance footage, but 1999 technology had its limits. Grainy. Low resolution. The kind of footage that turns faces into shadows and details into guesses. Still, they found it, the car. A shape more than a vehicle. No plate visible. No clear identifiers. Just a presence. Watching. Waiting. From that moment on, the investigation took a sharper edge. This wasn't random. This wasn't someone simply vanishing into the night. This felt targeted. Controlled. Planned. But by whom? The tape recorder became the center of everything. Forensic teams analyzed every second of audio. Background noise. Voice patterns. Environmental clues. Anything that could place her somewhere anywhere. They enhanced the audio, isolating frequencies, stripping away static layer by layer. What emerged was unsettling. Wind. Not just any wind, the kind that whistles through narrow spaces. Like between buildings. Or inside structures. At one point, a faint metallic echo. A door? A gate? Something closing? And then, buried deep in the recording, something even stranger, a rhythmic sound. Almost mechanical. Repeating at steady intervals. Some thought it was a train in the distance. Others weren't so sure. As days turned into weeks, leads began to dry up. The initial urgency faded into something heavier. A slow, creeping realization that this case might not resolve quickly. That whatever happened that night had been executed with precision. Too much precision. Rumors spread through the town. Whispers of a stalker. Of someone who had been watching her for weeks. Maybe months. People started locking their doors earlier. Walking in pairs. Looking over their shoulders in places that once felt safe. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Then, just when it seemed like the case might stall completely, another piece surfaced. A hunter, moving through a wooded area miles from where the car had been found, stumbled across something half buried beneath fresh snow. At first glance, it looked like debris. Trash. But when he brushed it off, the truth became impossible to ignore. A piece of fabric. Torn. Blood-stained. And matching the description of what she had been wearing the night she disappeared. The location changed everything. It meant she had been there. Or at least part of her had. Search teams flooded the area again, digging, probing, scanning for anything else that might have been left behind. But just like before, the landscape gave up nothing more. No body. No additional clothing. No weapon. Just that fragment. A single, silent confirmation that whatever happened had escalated far beyond a simple disappearance. The case deepened. Darkened. Hardened into something that refused to yield answers. And then, just as suddenly as it had ignited, the momentum slowed again. Months passed. Then years. The tape recorder sat in evidence storage, its contents replayed countless times by investigators who refused to let go. Each listen raising new questions. Each analysis offering just enough hope to keep the case alive, but never enough to solve it. The voice on the tape was never identified. The car in the surveillance footage was never traced. The location where the fabric was found never revealed anything more. And the woman at the center of it all never came home. The file was eventually labeled what no investigator ever wants to admit. Cold case. But even then, it didn't feel over. Because some cases don't fade. They linger. They wait. And sometimes they come back. The tape never stopped playing in their heads. Long after the evidence room lights were turned off, long after the reports were filed and archived, that faint breathing, that whisper, still there. Lingering. Crawling under the skin of every investigator who had listened to it one too many times. Because there was something wrong with it. Not just what it revealed, but what it held back. Colorado moved on, at least on the surface. Snow melted, roads cleared, routines returned. But beneath that normalcy, the case lingered like a stain that refused to fade. People still talked about it in lowered voices. Still glanced at the empty stretch of highway where the car had been found. Still wondered how someone could vanish so completely and leave behind something so deliberate. Months turned into a year. Then more. The case file thickened, but not with answers, only with attempts. Dead ends stacked on top of theories. Each new detective assigned to it started the same way, with the tape. They would sit in a dim room, headphones on, the audio feeding directly into their ears. Static. Breath. Whisper. Silence. Again and again. Searching for something others had missed. A hidden clue. A shift in tone. A background sound that might point somewhere real. One of them finally heard it. Not something new, but something overlooked. Between the wind and the low mechanical rhythm, there was a pattern. Subtle. Almost impossible to catch unless you were listening for it. A pause. Then a faint click. Then the rhythm resumed. Over and over, at nearly identical intervals. It wasn't random. It was structured. They brought in audio specialists, engineers who had spent years dissecting recordings down to the smallest frequencies. They isolated the sound, amplified it, cleaned it. What they found sent a ripple through the investigation. It wasn't just a mechanical noise. It was a signal. Some believed it matched industrial equipment, machinery used in factories or large facilities. Others argued it sounded more like a crossing gate, the kind you'd find near railroad tracks. But the timing didn't quite match typical patterns. Still, it gave them something they hadn't had in months. Direction. They began mapping out every possible location within a wide radius that could produce that kind of sound. Factories. Warehouses. Rail lines. Abandoned sites. Anything that fit the acoustic profile. The list was long. Too long. But they started narrowing it down. Cross-referencing locations with known routes she could have taken. Places accessible within the timeframe between her last confirmed sighting and the discovery of her car. Places isolated enough that no one would notice anything unusual. One location stood out. An old industrial complex, partially shut down in the late 90s. Not fully abandoned, but not fully operational either. A gray zone. The kind of place where activity could go unnoticed. Where noise blended into noise. Where something could happen behind closed doors and no one would ask questions. It sat just far enough off the main road to avoid attention. Just close enough to be reachable within minutes. Investigators moved in. The search was quiet at first. No press. No announcements. Just a small team, moving through rusted gates and silent corridors. The building smelled of oil and dust. Old machinery sat frozen in place, like relics of a past that refused to die. And then they heard it. That sound. Faint, but unmistakable. The same rhythm. The same mechanical pulse captured on the tape. It was coming from a section of the facility still in limited use. A piece of equipment that had never been fully decommissioned. It operated on a timer, cycling at steady intervals. Exactly like the recording. For the first time in years, the case felt alive again. They secured the area, brought in forensic teams, and began a full sweep. Every surface was tested. Every corner examined. Every inch documented. At first, nothing stood out. Then, in a storage room near the back of the complex, they found it. A chair. Metal. Bolted to the floor. Out of place. Not part of the original setup. Not consistent with the surrounding equipment. And on its surface, faint, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, traces. Biological. The lab results took weeks. When they came back, the room went silent. The DNA matched. It was hers. The implication hit like a shockwave. She had been there. Not just passing through, but restrained. Held in that room, at some point after she disappeared. The tape recorder suddenly made more sense. She hadn't just recorded something random. She had recorded that place. That moment. And possibly the person responsible. The investigation exploded back into motion. The facility's records were pulled. Employees, past and present, were identified and questioned. Security logs, what little existed, were examined. Maintenance schedules. Access points. Anything that could reveal who had been there during that window of time. Names surfaced. Dozens of them. But one, in particular, drew attention. A man who had worked irregular shifts. A man with access to multiple sections of the facility. A man who, according to records, had been on site the night she vanished. He wasn't on any radar before. No criminal history. No complaints. No obvious red flags. But now, everything about him felt wrong. Detectives tracked him down. By then, years had passed. He was older. Quieter. Living a life that, on the surface, looked ordinary. Too ordinary. The kind of ordinary that raises questions when you know what might be hiding beneath it. When they brought him in for questioning, he didn't panic. He didn't run. He sat calmly. Answered questions. Denied everything. Said he didn't remember that night. Said he barely used that part of the facility. Said a lot of things that sounded reasonable until you looked closer. His alibi was thin. His timeline had gaps. And when they played the tape for him, just a short segment, just enough to test his reaction, something shifted. Not in what he said, but in what he didn't. A pause. A flicker. Gone in a second. But enough. They dug deeper. Financial records. Phone logs. Any connection, no matter how small, that could tie him to her. But the link refused to appear. No calls. No messages. No shared locations. Nothing that explained why he would target her. Unless he didn't need to know her. Unless she had simply crossed his path at the wrong moment. The case twisted again. Because random didn't fit the precision. And precision didn't fit random. Weeks turned into months as investigators tried to build something solid, something that could hold up, something that could turn suspicion into proof. But the evidence, as chilling as it was, remained incomplete. The chair. The DNA. The sound. All of it pointed somewhere. But not far enough. Not yet. And then, just as the case seemed to hover on the edge of a breakthrough, another detail surfaced, buried deep in old files, overlooked in the chaos of the early investigation. The tape recorder itself. Not just what was on it, but how it got there. Because according to original reports, it hadn't been in plain sight when the car was first discovered. It had been found later. Placed. Deliberately. As if someone wanted it to be heard. As if someone wanted the case to be found. But not solved. And that realization changed everything. Because it meant one thing above all else. Whoever was responsible had never really left. The idea that the tape had been placed after the fact didn't just reopen the case, it poisoned it. Everything investigators thought they understood began to fracture. The car was no longer just a static crime scene. It became a message. A stage. Something arranged, not abandoned. Someone had returned to that roadside after she was already gone and left behind a voice. Not hers. His. That changed the timeline in ways no one had prepared for. Because if the tape wasn't there at the beginning, then the person responsible had come back. Risked exposure. Risked everything. Not to destroy evidence, but to introduce it. To guide the investigation without revealing too much. To let them hear just enough. And that meant confidence. Control. The kind of control that doesn't fade with time. The kind that lingers. Detectives went back to the original reports from the night the car was found, dissecting every line, every timestamp, every overlooked inconsistency. The first officer on scene had noted nothing unusual inside the vehicle beyond its orderly state. No personal belongings scattered. No sign of distress. And crucially, no tape recorder. But hours later, after the car had already been logged, photographed, and partially processed, another officer documented its presence. No explanation. No record of when it appeared. Just there. Sitting quietly on the passenger seat like it had always belonged. The realization hit hard. The scene had been compromised before anyone even knew it was a crime. And whoever had done it under their noses. That shifted the focus again. Not just to the night she disappeared, but to the hours that followed. Who had access to the scene? Who knew where the car was before it was secured? Who could have approached it without raising suspicion? The list was small. Too small. Officers. First responders. Tow operators. A handful of individuals who had been near the vehicle before it was fully locked down. All of them were interviewed again, years later, forced to revisit a moment they thought had long passed. Most had nothing new to offer. Memories faded. Details blurred. But one account stood out, not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it contradicted. A volunteer searcher. Someone who had arrived early, before the area was fully restricted. He remembered the car clearly. Remembered looking inside. Remembered thinking how strange it was that everything looked so normal. And he was certain of one thing. There had been nothing on that seat. No recorder. No device. Nothing. His statement aligned with the original report. Reinforced it. Strengthened the idea that the tape had been introduced later, after the initial discovery, during the chaotic window when the scene was vulnerable. Which meant the person responsible either blended in or belonged there. The investigation turned inward. Quietly at first. Carefully. No accusations. No public statements. Just a subtle shift in focus. Background checks were expanded. Not just on suspects, but on everyone who had touched the case in those early hours. It was a dangerous direction. Because it meant considering something no one wanted to say out loud. What if the person behind it all wasn't an outsider? What if they had been part of the response? The thought lingered, heavy and unwelcome. But the evidence demanded it. Meanwhile, the man from the industrial complex remained under scrutiny. The DNA connection couldn't be ignored. He had been there. She had been there. That link was real, undeniable. But the question of how and why remained unanswered. He continued to deny everything. No cracks. No slips. No confession. Just a wall. And yet, something about him refused to settle. Investigators kept circling back, replaying his interviews, studying his behavior. There was something in the way he spoke. The way he paused. The way he chose his words. Careful. Measured. Like someone who understood more than he was letting on. But understanding isn't proof. And proof is what they needed. Then came another break, small, almost insignificant at first glance, but enough to shift the ground again. A re-examination of the tape recorder itself. Not the audio. The device. For years, it had been treated as a container for evidence. Something that held clues, not something that was a clue. But with new forensic techniques available, methods that didn't exist in 1999, they decided to take another look. They processed it again. Every surface. Every seam. Every microscopic trace. And this time they found something. A partial print. Not clean. Not complete. But enough to analyze. Enough to compare. The lab ran it through databases. Local. State. Federal. No immediate match. But that didn't mean it was useless. Because they had someone in mind. The man from the facility. They requested his prints. Legally. Quietly. Carefully. And when the comparison came back, the room tightened with anticipation. It wasn't a full match. But it wasn't a mismatch either. It was close. Close enough to suggest contact. Close enough to raise the stakes. But not enough to hold in court. Frustration built again. They were circling something. Getting closer. Feeling it just out of reach. And then, just as the investigation seemed to teeter between breakthrough and collapse, something unexpected happened. A call. Anonymous. No caller ID. No traceable origin. Just a voice. Distorted. Low. Intentional. It didn't offer a name. Didn't provide a clear accusation. Just a statement. You're looking in the wrong place. Then a pause. Long enough to settle into the bones of whoever was listening. Go back to the tape. And then. Silence. The line went dead. At first, it sounded like a distraction. A prank. The kind of thing high-profile cases attract. But something about it felt different. The timing. The tone. The way it echoed the very uncertainty investigators were wrestling with. Go back to the tape. They had never really left it. But now, they listened differently. Not just for what was there, but for what wasn't. They broke it down again, frame by frame, second by second. Slowed it. Reversed it. Filtered it through every tool available. And that's when they heard it. Something so faint it had been buried beneath everything else. A second voice. Not the whisper. Not the breathing. Another presence. Further away. Muffled. Almost indistinguishable. But there. Two people. Not one. The implications rippled outward immediately. This wasn't a lone act. It wasn't a single moment of opportunity. It was something else. Something coordinated. And suddenly, the man from the facility didn't look like the whole answer anymore. He looked like a piece. One part of something larger. Something that had operated in silence for years. Something that had watched the investigation unfold and adjusted. The tape had been placed. The scene had been manipulated. The evidence had been controlled. Not just to hide the truth, but to shape it. And as that realization settled in, heavy and undeniable, one question rose above everything else. If there were two voices on that tape, then where was the second one now? And more importantly, which one had been watching all along? The moment they confirmed the second voice, the case shifted again, deeper, darker, more dangerous than anything they had prepared for. Because one voice can be hidden. Two voices require coordination. And coordination leaves traces. The tape was no longer just evidence, it was a conversation, fractured and incomplete, but real. Two people in the same space. Two presences surrounding her in what were likely the final recorded moments of her life. One close. Controlled. The whisper that had haunted investigators for years. The other distant. Muted. But there. Listening. Watching. Possibly directing. They isolated the second voice, stripping away layers of noise until only fragments remained. It wasn't enough to form words, not clearly, but the cadence was different. Slower. More deliberate. Less emotional. If the first voice carried tension beneath its calm, the second felt colder. Detached. Like someone observing rather than participating. That distinction mattered. Because it suggested roles. And roles meant structure. The theory began to take shape, quietly at first, then with growing weight. This wasn't an impulsive act. Not a random encounter gone wrong. It was staged. Managed. Possibly rehearsed. One individual engaging directly, the other maintaining distance. Oversight. Control. A system. And if it was a system, it might not have been used just once. That idea sent investigators back through unsolved cases across the region. Missing persons. Unidentified remains. Any incident that carried even the faintest echo of this one, isolated disappearance, minimal evidence, unexplained gaps in the timeline. Patterns began to flicker. Nothing definitive. Nothing strong enough to declare a connection. But enough to unsettle. Enough to raise the possibility that this wasn't the only story buried beneath the snow of Colorado in the late 90s. Meanwhile, the man from the industrial complex remained at the center, but no longer alone. His role, if any, had to be reconsidered. Was he the voice? The one whispering close to the recorder? Or the one in the background, silent, removed, watching it all unfold? Or neither? Interviews resumed. This time more aggressive. More focused. The detectives pressed harder, circling back to the same questions from different angles, watching for inconsistencies, for hesitation, for anything that might break the surface. He held steady. Too steady. Every answer measured. Every reaction controlled. The kind of composure that doesn't come from innocence, it comes from preparation. But even preparation has limits. And cracks, when they appear, are often small. It happened during a seemingly routine question. One of the investigators mentioned the tape again, casually, almost dismissively, referring to the voices in plural. Not singular. Not the original narrative. Just a slight shift. And for a fraction of a second, something changed. Not panic. Not fear. Recognition. It vanished almost instantly, buried beneath the same calm exterior. But it was there. Enough to confirm what they already suspected. He knew. Not everything. But something. And that was enough to keep pushing. They expanded the scope of his life. Not just his work at the facility, but everything. Past addresses. Known associates. Travel history. Financial anomalies. Any thread that might lead outward. That's when the second name surfaced. Not through a database. Not through a record. But through absence. A former coworker. Someone who had worked similar shifts. Had access to the same areas. Had been present during the same time period, and then, suddenly, wasn't. No formal resignation. No forwarding address. Just gone. At the time, it hadn't raised alarms. People leave. Jobs change. Lives shift. But now, in the context of everything else, it felt different. It felt intentional. Investigators dug into what little remained of his existence. Old employment files. Sparse personal information. A few scattered references from others who remembered him, but not clearly. Always described in vague terms. Quiet. Kept to himself. The kind of person who blends into the background so completely that when they disappear no one notices right away. Until it's too late. No current records. No active identification. No digital footprint, at least none that could be easily traced back. It was as if he had erased himself. Or had been erased. The possibility was chilling. Because if he was the second voice, then he had been there. In that room. In that moment. Part of whatever had happened to her. And then he vanished, leaving behind nothing but a ghost in the system. The investigation split along two paths, one grounded in what they could prove, the other chasing what they could feel but not yet touch. Forensics continued to reprocess old evidence with new technology. The chair, the room, the surrounding facility. Every particle, every fiber, every microscopic trace was examined again, searching for something, anything, that might connect the pieces more firmly. And then they found it. A fiber. Small. Nearly invisible. Trapped in a crack along the base of the chair. It didn't match her clothing. Didn't match anything in the immediate environment. But it matched something else. A type of material used in specialized workwear, protective gear, often worn in industrial settings. Not unique. Not rare. But specific enough to narrow possibilities. They cross-referenced it with employee records. Uniform suppliers. Purchase logs. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Both men, the one still present, and the one who had disappeared, had access to that type of gear. Another link. Another thread tightening around something they still couldn't fully see. But evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed movement. They needed pressure. So they changed tactics. Instead of pushing directly, they pulled back, at least on the surface. Reduced visible activity. Let the case appear to settle again. Quiet. Dormant. A cold case returning to its frozen state. But beneath that stillness, they watched. Waited. Because if someone had been bold enough to return once, to place that tape, to manipulate the scene, then maybe. Just maybe. They would do it again. Days passed. Then weeks. Nothing. And then, one night, something shifted. A patrol unit, passing along a remote access road near the old industrial site, noticed movement inside the facility. Lights, faint, intermittent, not consistent with the limited operations that still occurred there. The building was supposed to be empty at that hour. The officer called it in. Backup arrived quietly. They approached without sirens, without lights, moving through the same rusted gates investigators had walked through years before. The air felt the same. Heavy. Still. Holding something beneath its surface. Inside, the sound returned. That same mechanical rhythm. Steady. Unchanged. And layered over it. Something else. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Echoing through the empty corridors. The officers followed the sound, moving deeper into the structure, weapons drawn, breath controlled. Every corner felt like it might hold something waiting. And then they saw it. The room. The chair. And in front of it. A figure. Standing still. As if expecting them. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the figure turned. And everything changed. The figure didn't run. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Anyone else, anyone caught inside a restricted industrial site in the dead of night, standing in a room tied to a decades-old cold case, would panic. They would bolt, fight, scream, do something. Anything. But this one didn't. He turned slowly, as if the interruption had been expected. As if the timing had always been part of something larger. The dim light from a single overhead fixture caught the edge of his face, but not enough to fully reveal it. Just fragments, jawline, shadow, the faint glint of eyes that didn't look surprised. They looked ready. The officers shouted commands. Hands up. Get down. Don't move. He complied. No hesitation. No resistance. Just a smooth, almost practiced motion as he raised his hands and stepped back from the chair. The metallic leg scraped faintly against the concrete floor, a sound so subtle, yet so familiar that it sent a cold recognition through the room. That sound. It echoed something from the tape. He was taken into custody without incident. No weapon found. No immediate evidence on him beyond what he was wearing, a set of dark, heavy-duty work clothes, worn but clean, the kind that blends into industrial environments without drawing attention. And for a moment, it felt like the case had finally reached its breaking point. But cases like this don't break clean. They fracture. At the station, the interrogation began almost immediately. Time mattered now. Momentum mattered. The longer silence stretched, the more control shifted back to him. Because already, he had taken something back. By not running. By not resisting. By being there. He had changed the narrative. The first question was simple. Why were you there? He didn't answer right away. He looked at them, really looked this time, as if measuring something. Not fear. Not confusion. Just calculation. Then, finally, he spoke. I used to work there. The voice. It hit them instantly. Not identical, but close. Too close. There was something in the tone. The rhythm. The way the word settled into the air. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to tighten the room. Years ago, he added, almost casually. Just checking on something. It sounded rehearsed. Because it was. They pushed harder. Asked about the room. The chair. The late-night visit. Each question sharper than the last, each one probing for inconsistency, for hesitation, for anything that might crack the surface. But he held. Not by deflecting. By narrowing. He answered only what was asked. Nothing more. No elaboration. No slips. A controlled flow of information, just enough to maintain the appearance of cooperation without giving anything away. And yet he hadn't asked why he was there. He hadn't asked what they knew. He hadn't asked about the case. Which meant one thing. He already understood. Hours into the interrogation, they shifted tactics. They played the tape. Not all of it. Just a fragment. The breathing. The whisper. The silence. They watched him carefully as the audio filled the room. At first, nothing. Then, just for a second. That same flicker. Recognition. Not surprise. Not curiosity. Something deeper. Memory. He looked down slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to break direct eye contact. And in that moment, the control slipped, not completely, but just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. Do you recognize that? One of the detectives asked. A pause. Then. No. Flat. Immediate. Too immediate. Because people who don't recognize something usually take time. They listen. They consider. They search for familiarity. He didn't. He denied it before the sound had even fully faded. And that told them more than any confession could have. They changed direction again. Mentioned the second voice. Not as a theory. As a fact. There are two people on that recording. This time, the reaction was different. Subtle, but real. His shoulders tensed. Just slightly. His breathing shifted, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But they were. They had been waiting for something like this. Who was the other one? The detective pressed. Silence. Longer this time. He leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused for a moment, as if considering something far away. Not the question itself, but the weight behind it. Then he spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. But the tone had changed. Less certain. Less controlled. The first real crack. They pushed again, harder now. The missing coworker. The DNA. The fiber. The room. The tape. Layer after layer, closing in, tightening the space around him until the air itself seemed to press down. And then he smiled. Not wide. Not obvious. Just enough to be seen. And everything in the room shifted. Because it wasn't the smile of someone cornered. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for them to get there. "You're close," he said quietly. The words landed heavy. Measured. Deliberate. But not close enough. No one spoke for a second. Because that wasn't denial. That wasn't confusion. That was confirmation. And a warning. "Where is she?" another detective demanded, the question cutting through the tension. The smile faded. Replaced by something colder. Still looking in the wrong place. The same phrase. Almost identical to the anonymous call. The connection hit instantly. "You made the call," one of them said. No response. But he didn't deny it. He didn't deny anything anymore. He just stopped giving. And that was the moment they realized something critical. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He was controlling what being caught meant. They held him. Charged him with what they could, trespassing, obstruction, anything to keep him in custody while they built something stronger. But the core of the case, the disappearance, the murder, whatever had truly happened in that room, still sat just out of reach. Because he wasn't the whole story. He had said it without saying it. Two voices. Two people. And the second one was still missing. Still out there. And maybe still watching. That thought settled in slowly, like a shadow creeping across the edges of everything they thought they understood. Because if he had returned to that place after all these years, if he had stood in that room again, near that chair, near the echoes of what had happened, then it wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. A pattern. A need. Or a signal. And as investigators reviewed the footage from that night, every step, every movement, every second leading up to his arrest, they noticed something they hadn't seen before. He hadn't arrived alone. Not exactly. There was another vehicle. Caught briefly on a distant camera along the access road. Far enough away to avoid clear identification. But close enough to matter. It never approached the building. Never entered the site. It stopped. Waited. Lights off. Engine running. Just for a few minutes. And then it left. The same pattern. The same presence. Watching. Waiting. Just like the night she disappeared. Just like the gas station. Just like the tape. Two people. One close. One in the shadows. And now, after all these years, after everything that had been uncovered, everything that had been exposed, one of them was finally in custody. And the other had just come back. The second vehicle changed everything. Until that moment, the investigation had been tightening inward, focusing on the man in custody, on the room, on the evidence that had finally begun to speak after years of silence. But now, the case expanded again, stretching outward into the dark spaces it had never fully illuminated. Because history was repeating itself. A vehicle, positioned at a distance. Engine running. Lights off. Waiting, but never approaching. The exact same behavior reported the night she vanished. The exact same pattern captured in grainy footage from a gas station decades earlier. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. Investigators pulled every available frame from the roadside camera that had captured the second car. The quality was marginally better than the footage from 1999, but still frustratingly limited. The vehicle's outline was clearer, mid-sized, older model, nothing distinctive enough to immediately identify. No visible license plate. No defining marks. Just a silhouette. A presence. They enhanced what they could. Adjusted contrast. Isolated reflections. Even tracked the faint glow from the dashboard through the windshield. And then, buried in one frame, visible for less than a second, they saw movement inside. A driver. Still. Watching. Facing toward the facility. Not toward the road. Not scanning the surroundings. Focused. Waiting for something to happen inside that building. Waiting for him. The implication settled like a weight. The man in custody hadn't returned alone. He had been brought. Or at least accompanied. Which meant the connection between the two voices on the tape hadn't faded with time. It had endured. Decades. That realization triggered a shift in urgency. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. This was about containment. About understanding whether whatever had started in 1999 was still active. Whether it had ever stopped. They widened the search radius around the facility, pulling traffic camera data from every accessible route within miles. Most of it led nowhere: routine movement, unrelated vehicles, the normal flow of night traffic. But they kept narrowing, isolating patterns, filtering out noise. Eventually, they found it again. The same vehicle. Further down the road. Minutes after it left the access point. It moved steadily, without urgency, without deviation. No sudden turns. No attempts to evade detection. Just a quiet exit into the larger network of roads that spread out into the state. And then it disappeared. No further hits. No clear direction. Gone. Just like before. Back at the station, the man in custody remained as controlled as ever. If he knew about the second vehicle, he didn't show it. If he had expected them to find it, he didn't acknowledge it. But something had changed. Not in what he said. In how he waited. There was a patience to him now. A stillness that felt intentional. As if he understood that time was no longer working against him. As if he knew something they didn't. The interrogations continued, but progress slowed. Every question met with deflection. Every angle anticipated. It was like trying to move through a maze where the walls shifted just ahead of you. So they changed the pressure. Instead of asking about the past, they focused on the present. The car that was with you that night, one detective said, placing a still image from the camera on the table. Who was driving it? No response. Just that same neutral expression. We know you didn't walk there, another added. We know someone brought you. Or followed you. Either way, you weren't alone. A pause. Then. You're assuming a lot. The first real acknowledgement. Not denial. Not confirmation. But engagement. And that was enough. They pushed harder. Two voices on the tape, the detective said. Two people at the facility. Two vehicles then, two vehicles now. It's not a coincidence. Silence. Longer this time. He looked at the image on the table. Not quickly. Not casually. He studied it. And for the first time, there was something else in his eyes. Not fear. Not exactly. But awareness. Like he understood the line they were getting close to crossing. You think you understand what you're looking at, he said finally, voice low, steady. You don't. Then explain it. A slight shake of his head. You wouldn't hear it anyway. The words hung there, heavy with implication. Because this had never been just about what was visible. It had always been about what was hidden beneath it. They pivoted again. Back to the tape. But not the voices. The silence between them. They had always focused on the sounds, the breathing, the whispers, the mechanical rhythm. But now, they began analyzing the gaps. The pauses. The moments where nothing seemed to happen. Because sometimes, nothing is where everything hides. They mapped out the timing of the recording, second by second. Identified every break, every lull, every subtle shift in background noise. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The pauses weren't random. They aligned. With something external. Something rhythmic, but not mechanical. Human. Movement. Steps. 2 sets. At different intervals. One closer. One further away. Crossing paths. Separating. Rejoining. It painted a picture, not clear, not complete, but enough to feel. She hadn't just been in one place. She had been moved. Within that space. Guided. Positioned. And recorded. The tape wasn't a single moment. It was a sequence. A controlled environment where time itself had been structured. That realization hit hard. Because it meant the recording wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Constructed. A piece of something larger. And if it had been constructed once, it could be constructed again. They returned to the facility, this time with a different objective. Not just to search, but to reconstruct. To understand the physical space the way it had been used then, not as it existed now. They walked the corridors. Timed the distances. Measured the acoustics. Recreated the path suggested by the audio. And then, in that same room, the chair, the walls, the echoes of something that refused to leave, they played the tape again. Out loud. Letting the sound fill the space it had once occupied. And for a moment, everything aligned. The rhythm. The pauses. The movement. It fit. Too perfectly. As if the room itself remembered. As if it had been waiting. And then, something else. Faint. Barely audible beneath the recording. A third sound. Not on the tape. In the room. A shift. A presence. Behind them. They turned instantly. Nothing. Just empty space. Silent. Still. But the feeling didn't leave. Because it wasn't just imagination. Someone had been there. Watching. Again. The pattern repeating, closer now than ever before. Back at the station, the report came in within the hour. A nearby resident had called in something unusual, another vehicle, parked along the same stretch of access road. Engine running. Lights off. The officers responded immediately. But by the time they arrived, it was gone. No tire tracks clear enough to follow. No witnesses who saw it leave. Just the lingering sense that they had missed it. By seconds. And as that realization settled in, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't reactive. It wasn't someone scrambling to avoid capture. It was controlled. Measured. Like a game being played in real time. One move for every move. One step ahead. Always. And somewhere in that shifting distance, in the space between what they knew and what they were being shown, the second voice was still there. Still moving. Still deciding what happened next. And the question that began to take shape, sharper and more dangerous than anything before, wasn't just who they were. But why they had come back now. After all these years. After all this silence. Why now? Because whatever the answer was, it hadn't finished yet. The question, why now, didn't sit quietly. It spread. Through every report, every interview, every sleepless hour spent replaying the same fragments of sound and silence, it lingered like something alive. Because nothing about this felt accidental anymore. Not the return to the facility. Not the second vehicle. Not the timing. After decades of nothing, everything was happening again, precise, deliberate, almost scheduled. And that meant intention. They stopped asking what had happened in 1999. They started asking what had started. Because if this was a system, if it had roles, structure, repetition, then it wasn't just a crime. It was a process. Back in the interrogation room, the man in custody had gone quiet again. Not the defensive silence from before. Not the controlled responses. This was different. He wasn't resisting. He was waiting. And that patience began to feel like pressure. Because every hour that passed without answers wasn't neutral, it was movement. Somewhere beyond the walls of that room, beyond the cameras, beyond the reach of warrants and patrols, something was still unfolding. They brought him back in. No tape this time. No evidence laid out. Just questions that didn't look like questions. Who taught you? It landed without warning. A shift from accusation to origin. For the first time, he didn't respond immediately. A flicker. Small, but real. Not everything starts the way you think it does, he said finally, voice quieter than before. Then how does it start? A pause. Longer than any before it. And then. It starts with being seen. The words felt out of place. Too abstract. Too distant from the concrete brutality of what they were investigating. But something about them stuck. Seen by who? No answer. They pushed again. The other one, the detective said. The one in the car. The one on the tape. Where is he? This time, the reaction was sharper. Not panic. Not fear. But resistance. You keep saying he, the man replied, almost casually. A subtle correction. But enough. The room tightened. Then what is it? The detective pressed. A slight smile again, fainter than before, but colder. That's the problem, he said. You think it's that simple. The ambiguity hit harder than a denial. Because it expanded the unknown. They had assumed structure, 2 men, 2 roles, 2 voices. But what if that structure wasn't fixed? What if the roles shifted? What if the second presence wasn't just one person? What if it was something that changed? That thought didn't just complicate the case, it fractured it. They stepped back from the interrogation again, not out of hesitation, but to recalibrate. The investigation had been narrowing, focusing on individuals, building toward something tangible. But now it had to widen again, reconsider assumptions, reframe the entire structure of what they were dealing with. Because if the second voice wasn't fixed, then the system wasn't static. It was adaptive. They returned to the past, but differently this time. Not looking for a single missing coworker. Looking for patterns of disappearance. Turnover. Gaps. Anyone connected to that facility, directly or indirectly, who had faded out of records without clear explanation. Not just one name, but multiple. And slowly, disturbingly, they found them. Not many. But enough. Over a span of years, late 90s into early 2000s, there were several individuals linked to the site who had left abruptly. No formal records. No clear destinations. Just absence. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now, it felt like a sequence. They mapped them out. Timelines. Overlaps. Points of intersection. And something began to emerge. Not a straight line. A cycle. Each disappearance spaced out. Not random. Not frequent. But consistent enough to suggest design. And at the center of that cycle. Moments. Specific points in time where something might have happened. Something unreported. Something buried beneath the surface of routine life. They cross-referenced those dates with other records, missing persons, local incidents, unexplained reports. And then they saw it. A case. Not identical, but close. Another disappearance. Same region. Different year. Different victim. But the details echoed. Car found. No signs of struggle. Sparse evidence. And one detail that hadn't meant anything back then. A recording device. Recovered. Empty. No audio. No explanation. It had been dismissed as unrelated. Now, it wasn't. It was a precursor. Or a failed attempt. Or something else entirely. The realization hit with a cold certainty. This hadn't started in 1999. That was just the first time it had been noticed. Back in the present, the second vehicle remained a ghost. No plate. No ID. No confirmed sightings beyond those brief flashes on camera. But the pattern of its presence, arrive, wait, disappear, was too consistent to ignore. So they changed tactics again. If they couldn't find the vehicle directly, they would find its behavior. They analyzed traffic patterns across similar nights, same time, same routes, same low visibility windows. Looked for vehicles that moved without purpose, that stopped where they shouldn't, that lingered just outside the edges of attention. It was like searching for a shadow in the dark. But eventually, they found something. Not the same car. Not definitively. But a match in behavior. Another night. Another road. Another vehicle stopping briefly in a location that didn't make sense. Engine running. Lights off. And then leaving. They tracked it backward. Through cameras. Through intersections. Through fragments of movement stitched together across miles. And finally, they got a plate. Partial. But enough. The registration came back to a name. No immediate flags. No criminal history. No obvious connection to the case. Just another ordinary life. Another person who, on the surface, didn't belong in any of this. But that had been true before. Too many times. They brought the name into the room. Placed it on the table in front of the man in custody. No explanation. No context. Just a single word. And watched. This time, the reaction was immediate. Not physical. Not visible in the way they had been trained to detect. But internal. A shift. A recognition that didn't need to show itself to be felt. "You're getting closer," he said quietly. Again. The same phrase. But this time, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a threshold. "Who is it?" the detective asked. Silence. Then. "It depends," he said. "On what?" A pause. And then, the answer that changed everything. "On when you're looking." The room went still. Because that wasn't deflection. That was structure. Time mattered. Timing mattered. Which meant whatever this was, it wasn't just about people. It was about sequence. Moments. Windows. And suddenly, the question why now began to shift into something more precise. Not just why. But why this moment? Why this point in time? They went back to the original date. The night she disappeared. And started building outward, not just in days or weeks, but in years. Looking for alignment. Intervals. Anything that might reveal a pattern beneath the chaos. And slowly. It appeared. Not perfect. Not exact. But close enough to feel intentional. A cycle measured not in days. But in decades. And if that pattern held, then what was happening now wasn't random. It was the next point. The next turn. The next moment in something that had been set in motion long before anyone realized it was there. And if that was true, then this wasn't the end of the case reopening. It was the beginning of something repeating. Something that hadn't finished in 1999. Something that had waited, watched, and was now starting again. The idea of a cycle didn't just change the direction of the investigation, it changed its urgency. Because cycles don't wait. They arrive. And if what they were seeing was real, if the spacing, the disappearances, the echoes across years weren't coincidence, then whatever had happened in 1999 wasn't just being revisited. It was being reenacted. The difference now was awareness. Back then, it had unfolded in silence. No one knew what to look for. No one understood the pattern. It slipped through unnoticed, leaving behind fragments that only made sense decades later. Now, they were watching. But so was the other side. And that meant every move mattered. They rebuilt the timeline again, this time not as a straight line, but as a loop. The original disappearance. The earlier case with the empty recorder. The gaps in employment. The vanishing names. The return to the facility. The second vehicle. Each point marked. Each interval measured. And at the center of it all, the tape. Always the tape. Because the tape wasn't just evidence. It was a record of a moment. A moment that might be repeating. They isolated its duration. Total runtime. Exact seconds between the first breath and the final silence. Then they compared it to the movement pattern they had reconstructed inside the facility, the pacing, the pauses, the distances. It aligned too cleanly. Like a script. And if it was a script, then it could be followed. That realization landed hard. Because it meant they weren't just investigating something that had already happened. They were chasing something that might be happening again. Right now. They moved fast. Pulled patrols into a tighter radius around the facility and surrounding routes. Increased presence without making it obvious. Quiet surveillance. Unmarked vehicles. Eyes on the access road. But they knew one thing already. Whoever they were dealing with noticed patterns. So the surveillance had to feel invisible. Natural. Like nothing had changed. Back in custody, the man watched the shifts without being told about them. He could feel it. The change in tone. The sharper questions. The way the detectives no longer circled but moved directly. "You think you're ahead now," he said at one point, almost conversational. No one answered. Because answering would confirm it. And confirmation was control. They brought the timeline into the room, not physically, but in fragments. Dates mentioned casually. Years dropped into questions. References to past cases slipped into conversation as if they were unrelated. They weren't asking anymore. They were building pressure. And he felt it. "You're not stopping it," he said quietly. That word. Stopping. Not solving. Not understanding. Stopping. The implication hit immediately. "There's something to stop," one detective asked. A pause. Then. "There always is." The certainty in his voice wasn't performative. It was lived. And that made it dangerous. Because it meant whatever this was, he didn't see it as an isolated act. He saw it as inevitable. They pivoted again. The new name, the one tied to the partial plate, became the next focal point. Surveillance was placed on the address. Quiet. Distant. Watching for patterns, not action. At first, nothing stood out. Normal routines. Work. Home. Small movements that fit into a life that, on the surface, made sense. But something about it felt too clean. Too contained. No deviations. No unpredictability. It was controlled. Just like everything else. They dug deeper. Financial records. Travel history. Connections. And then they found it. A gap. Not large. Just a few days. Unaccounted for. Right now. In the present. The same window they were in. The same moment the pattern suggested something might be happening. The same moment the man in custody had returned to the facility. It wasn't coincidence. It was overlap. They moved. A warrant was prepared. A team assembled. Timing synchronized down to the minute. Because if they were right, they weren't just investigating a pattern. They were stepping into it. The approach was silent. No sirens. No lights. Just controlled movement through dark streets, closing in on a house that looked like every other house on the block. Quiet. Still. Unremarkable. But inside, something might already be unfolding. They breached. Fast. Clean. Rooms cleared one by one. Empty. No resistance. No presence. Just absence. Again. But this time, the absence wasn't quiet. It felt recent. Drawers slightly open. A chair not fully pushed in. A glass on the counter, half full. The kind of details that don't matter until they do. Then they found the room. Not hidden. Not locked. Just there. And inside. A device. Another recorder. Different model. Same idea. Powered on. Recording. The red light blinking steadily in the dim. They stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Because this wasn't discovery. This was confirmation. The cycle wasn't theoretical. It was active. One of them stepped forward, reached out, and pressed stop. The room fell into silence. But it didn't feel like silence. It felt like interruption. They played it back immediately. The audio filled the space. And for a second, time folded. Because it was the same. The breathing. The wind. The mechanical rhythm. But clearer. Closer. More defined. And then, a voice. Not the same as before, but carrying the same tone. Calm. Controlled. Familiar in a way that didn't make sense yet. And beneath it, another. Further away. Watching. Two voices. Again. But this time, it wasn't history. It was now. The realization hit all at once. They weren't chasing echoes anymore. They were inside the pattern. And somewhere, not far, whoever was on that recording was still there. Still moving. Still in control of whatever came next. The team split instantly. One group securing the house, pulling everything, devices, prints, fibers, anything that could hold a trace. The other moving out. Following the only direction left. Sound. Because if the recording matched the original, then the environment might too. They mapped the acoustics in real time, comparing the background noise to known locations. Wind patterns. Industrial rhythms. The faint metallic echo that had haunted the first tape. And it pointed them back. Not to the same room, but to the same area. The facility. Again. The realization was almost unbearable in its simplicity. They had come full circle. But this time, they weren't late. They moved fast. Faster than before. Because now they knew. This wasn't a place that held answers. It was a place where things happened. And if they got there in time, for the first time in decades, they might not be listening to a recording. They might be walking into the moment itself. They didn't speak on the way back. No one needed to. The weight of what they had just heard, the fresh recording, the same structure, the same controlled environment, pressed down on every second as they sped through the dark toward the facility. This time, there was no uncertainty about what they were walking into. This wasn't evidence. This wasn't aftermath. This was in progress. The road stretched out ahead, empty in that familiar, suffocating way. The same kind of road where a car could sit unnoticed. Where an engine could idle without question. Where someone could wait in the dark and never be seen. And as they turned onto the access route, headlights cutting through the silence, they saw it. The vehicle. Parked. Engine running. Lights off. Exactly where it had been before. Exactly where it was supposed to be. No hesitation this time. Units moved in immediately, cutting off the exit, surrounding the car before it could disappear again. Doors opened. Commands shouted. Weapons raised. But the driver didn't flee. Didn't resist. Didn't even look surprised. They stepped out slowly, hands visible, movements calm, too calm. And in that moment, something felt wrong again. Because it wasn't fear in their eyes. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. Not of the officers. Of the moment. As if they knew this was coming. As if this had always been part of the sequence. They were taken into custody without incident. No struggle. No questions. Just silence. And the quiet, unsettling sense that this had not disrupted anything. It had fulfilled something. There was no time to process it. Not yet. Because inside the facility, something was still happening. The team moved in fast, faster than before, clearing corridors with precision, following the now familiar path toward the back of the structure. The mechanical rhythm echoed again, louder this time, layered with something else. Movement. Not distant. Not fading. Present. Active. They reached the room. The chair. And for a fraction of a second, everything froze. Because it wasn't empty. She was there. Alive. Bound. Exactly where the tape had always suggested, but this time, real. Her breathing uneven, matching the pattern they had heard so many times before. Her eyes wide, unfocused, caught somewhere between awareness and shock. And standing just beyond her? A figure. Still. Waiting. The moment stretched. The same tension captured on the recordings, now unfolding in real time. Step away, one of the officers shouted. The figure didn't move. Didn't react. Just stood there, as if listening to something only they could hear. Step away now. Then slowly, they turned. And for the first time, there was no shadow to hide behind. No grainy footage. No distorted audio. A face. Clear. Visible. And completely unfamiliar. Not the man in custody. Not the missing co-worker. Someone else. A third presence. The structure shattered instantly. Two voices had never meant two people. It had always meant something more. They moved in. Fast. Controlled. The figure didn't resist. Didn't reach for anything. Didn't try to escape. Just stepped back, hands rising slightly, not in surrender, but in something that felt rehearsed. Like every movement had been done before. Like this moment had already happened. They secured the victim first. Cut restraints. Checked vitals. She was conscious, but barely. disoriented, unable to speak clearly, but alive. That was enough. That was everything. Behind them, the figure was restrained, placed on the ground, secured. Still calm. Still silent. And as they moved them out of the room, past the chair, past the walls that had held decades of unanswered questions, something lingered. A feeling that didn't match the outcome. Because this should have been the end. The interruption. The break in the cycle. But it didn't feel broken. It felt completed. Back outside, the scene filled quickly, units, lights, controlled chaos replacing the silence that had defined the case for so long. The second driver was secured separately, the third individual held under guard, the victim rushed toward medical support. And yet, even as everything unfolded, something didn't settle. Because when they searched the third individual, they found nothing. No ID. No phone. No traceable connection to anything. Just the same kind of clothing. The same kind of presence. As if they had stepped into the role, without leaving anything behind. Back at the station, the three were separated immediately. 3 points in a structure that had never been fully understood. The first man. The driver. And now, the one in the room. Interrogations began again. Simultaneously. Different rooms. Different strategies. But the same question echoing through all of them. What is this? The driver spoke first. Not much. But enough. I wasn't supposed to be seen, they said quietly. Not denial. Not confusion. A statement of deviation. You were waiting, the detective replied. Just like before. A pause. Then. That's how it works. Works. Present tense. Still active. Who told you to be there? Silence. Then a slight shift. You think it starts with a person. The same idea. The same deflection. Or maybe not a deflection at all. In another room, the third individual sat motionless, eyes steady, breathing calm. When questioned, they didn't deny anything. But they didn't confirm anything either. They answered differently. You arrived on time, one detective said. A faint tilt of the head. Of course. Why? A pause. And then. Because it was time. Not planned. Not ordered. Time. Sequence. Cycle. The same pattern repeating through every answer, every silence, every fragment of information that refused to fit into a normal framework. And then, in the final room. The first man. The one who had been there from the beginning. The one who had waited. Watched. Guided them here. He listened as they laid it out. The second vehicle. The third person. The victim. The recording. Everything. And for the first time, he laughed. Not loudly. Not uncontrollably. Just a quiet, almost relieved sound. You think you stopped it, he said. No one answered. Because they needed to hear what came next. You didn't. The words landed heavier than anything before. Then what did we do? The detective asked. A long pause. And then. You arrived at the same place we did. The room went still. Because that wasn't defeat. It wasn't victory. It was something else. Something that reframed everything. This had never been about getting away. It had never been about avoiding capture. It had been about completion. And now, they were part of it. That realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like something sinking beneath the surface, impossible to ignore once it was there. Because the pattern hadn't been broken. It had been fulfilled. The roles had been filled. The moment had happened. Again. And as the night stretched on, as the reports were written and the evidence catalogued and the three individuals sat in separate rooms, silent and still, one question remained. Not who they were. Not what they had done. But what came next. Because cycles don't end when they repeat. They continue. And somewhere in the space between what had just been stopped and what might already be beginning again, something was still moving. Still waiting. For the next moment. For the next voice. For the next person. To take their place. The room didn't feel like a victory. It should have. 3 people in custody. A victim recovered alive. Physical evidence. Recordings that no longer belong to the past. After decades of silence, everything had finally converged into something real, something tangible, something that should have closed the gap between mystery and resolution. But it didn't. Because nothing about what they had uncovered behaved like a crime that wanted to be solved. It behaved like something that wanted to continue. The 3 were processed separately, documented, photographed, recorded down to the smallest detail. Fingerprints run. DNA taken. Background checks expanded beyond standard limits. Every system they had, local, state, federal, pushed to its edge. The first man, the one tied to the original facility, the one who had waited all these years, remained exactly as he had been since the beginning. Calm. Measured. Unmoved. The driver was different. Less composed. Not panicked, but uncertain in a way that suggested they hadn't fully understood the scope of what they were part of. Their answers came slower. Their silence felt less controlled, more learned. And the third, the one in the room, remained the most unsettling of all. Because they didn't behave like someone who had been caught. They behaved like someone who had arrived. Interrogation stretched through the night. No sleep. No breaks long enough to reset. Because time still mattered. It always had. They started with the driver again. You said you weren't supposed to be seen, the detective pressed. Who told you that? A pause. Longer than before. Then. No one tells you. The answer came quietly, almost reluctantly. Then how do you know? Another pause. And then. You learn. Learn. Not instructed. Not ordered. Absorbed. The implication was immediate. This wasn't command. It was transmission. Something passed on. From who, the detective pushed. Silence. Then a slight shift in posture. A hesitation that hadn't been there before. And finally, from whoever is already there. The word settled into the room like something heavy. Because that wasn't hierarchy. That wasn't a leader giving orders. That was succession. A system that didn't rely on identity. Just position. Roles. The same roles that had echoed through the tape, through the recordings, through the patterns that stretched across decades. One close. One distant. One watching. And now. 3. They moved to the third individual. You were in the room, the detective said. You were the one speaking. A slight nod. Not confirmation. Not denial. Just acknowledgement of the statement itself. Why her? A pause. And then. It was her time. Again. Time. Always time. Who decides that? The faintest hint of something changed in their expression. Not emotion. Recognition. You're still asking the wrong question. The same phrase. Repeated across different voices. Different people. different roles, but always the same structure. As if the answers weren't meant to be understood the way they were being asked. As if the framework itself was wrong. They brought the first man back in. The one who had started all of this, at least, the one who had brought them to it. They laid everything out. The driver's statements. The third individual's responses. The structure. The roles. The idea of learning, of succession, of timing. He listened. Quiet. Still. And then. "You're almost there," he said. The phrase again. Closer. Closer. But never complete. "What are we missing?" the detective demanded. For the first time, he leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively. Not confrontationally. Just enough to close the distance. "You think this is about people," he said. "We have people," the detective replied sharply. "We have all of you." A faint shake of the head. "That's not what I mean." Silence. Heavy. Waiting. Then. "You think you caught something." A pause. Then the correction. "You didn't catch anything." The words landed harder than anything before. Because they didn't reject the arrests. They reframed them. "Then what is this?" the detective asked. And this time. He answered. "It's a point." The room stilled. A point in what? A longer pause. And then. In something that doesn't stop just because you're looking at it. The meaning began to form, slow and cold. This wasn't a chain. It wasn't a group. It wasn't even a pattern in the traditional sense. It was something that existed independent of being observed. Something that continued whether or not anyone understood it. Then why come back? The detective pressed. Why risk everything? The faintest hint of that smile again. Not mocking. Not arrogant. Certain. Because this is where it happens. The facility. The room. The chair. Not just a location. A point. And if that was true, then the place mattered more than the people. The realization shifted everything again. Because people could be removed. Arrested. Stopped. But a place? A place remained. They moved immediately. The facility was locked down fully this time. No partial access. No gray zones. Complete control. Every entrance sealed. Every inch monitored. Because if what they were hearing was true, then it wasn't enough to stop the individuals. They had to stop the point. Back at the station, the victim had begun to stabilize. Still shaken. Still fragmented. But conscious. Able to speak. Barely. They kept the questions minimal. Careful. Because whatever she had been through, it wasn't something that could be forced into clarity. But there was one thing they needed to know. When you were there, the investigator asked gently, "How many people did you hear?" A pause. Her eyes unfocused for a moment, as if reaching back into something she didn't want to touch. "Two," she whispered. Then. A longer pause. Her breathing shifted. And she added. "And something else." The room went quiet. Because that wasn't confusion. That wasn't trauma speaking. That was distinction. "What do you mean?" the investigator asked. Her head moved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I don't know," she said. "It wasn't a person." The word settled into the space like something that didn't belong there. Because everything up to this point, every theory, every structure, every attempt to make sense of it, had been built on people. On roles. On actions. But now, that foundation shifted. Again. Back in the interrogation room, the first man sat in silence as they relayed what she had said. He didn't react immediately. But when he did, it wasn't surprise. It was recognition. "You heard it too," one of the detectives said. A long pause. And then, "We all do," he replied quietly. The words didn't raise their voices. They lowered them. Because something about that answer felt closer to the truth than anything else they had heard. And that made it worse. Because if this wasn't just about people, if it wasn't just about roles being passed from one to another, if there was something else at the center of it, something that remained constant while everything else changed, then stopping it wasn't going to be as simple as arrests. It wasn't going to be as simple as closing a case. Because whatever had started this, whatever had been present in that room in 1999, whatever had been recorded on that tape, whatever had just happened again, it was still there. And it wasn't in custody. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And as the night pushed toward morning, as the facility sat locked down under constant watch, as three individuals remained in separate rooms, silent and waiting, the case didn't feel solved. It didn't even feel contained. It felt paused. Balanced on the edge of something that hadn't decided whether to stop or continue. Because if this really was just a point, then the line it belonged to was still out there. Still moving. Still unfolding. And somewhere beyond what they could see, beyond what they could prove. It was already heading toward the next moment. Morning didn't bring clarity. It never does in cases like this. It just replaces darkness with something colder, light that exposes details without explaining them, that sharpens the edges of everything that already feels wrong. The facility sat under full lockdown, surrounded, monitored, stripped of the anonymity it had relied on for decades. Every entrance sealed. Every corridor watched. Every sound catalogued. And still, it didn't feel contained. Because whatever had been there didn't behave like something that could be surrounded. Inside, the room remained exactly as they had left it. The chair. The space. The air itself carrying a weight that hadn't lifted, even after everything that had happened within it. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting again, reprocessing again, searching for anything that might have been missed, not because they expected new evidence, but because they no longer trusted what complete meant. Every surface was tested. Every trace collected. And yet, the deeper they went, the more the same conclusion returned. Everything important had already happened. Not just last night. Not just in 1999. But in a way that didn't belong to a single moment. Back at the station, the three remained separate. The first man had stopped speaking entirely. Not out of resistance. Out of completion. There was nothing left for him to say. The driver shifted between silence and fragments, small answers that didn't build into anything whole. Enough to confirm pieces, never enough to reveal structure. And the third remained still. Not waiting. Not reacting. Just present. As if their role, whatever it had been, had already been fulfilled. The interrogation slowed, not because the urgency had faded, but because the shape of the case no longer fit the tools being used to solve it. Questions that once felt sharp now landed without impact. Answers that once felt close now dissolved before they could form anything solid. Because the problem wasn't lack of information. It was meaning. They had everything. Voices. People. A victim. A location. A pattern. And still, no explanation that held. The investigators gathered, not to plan the next move, but to understand where the last one had led them. "We stopped it," one of them said. But it didn't sound certain. It sounded like a question. "No," another replied quietly. "We interrupted it." The distinction settled heavily. Because interruption implies continuation. Something paused. Something delayed. Not something ended. They returned to the timeline one final time, not looking for patterns now, but for closure. For a point where something could be said to begin or end. But it refused. Every starting point led backward. Every ending point looped forward. The disappearance in 1999 wasn't the beginning. The rescue last night wasn't the end. They were just moments. Points. Exactly as he had said. And if that was true, then the case couldn't be closed in the way they needed it to be. Because it wasn't a line. It was something that circled back on itself. The victim's statement added to that weight. She remembered fragments. The room. The voices. The feeling of being moved, positioned, observed. And something else. Always just outside clarity. Not seen. Not fully heard. But present. Consistent. Unchanging. They asked her to describe it. She couldn't. Not in words that made sense. It wasn't like them, she said slowly. It didn't feel like a person. The same distinction. Again. Across time. Across victims. Across recordings. The same absence of definition. And that absence became the center of everything. Because everything else, the people, the roles, the actions, those could be mapped, tracked, stopped. But this, whatever this was, didn't behave like something that could be identified, only experienced. And that made it impossible to isolate. Impossible to remove. They returned to the recordings, both of them. And now, played side by side. Aligned. Matched. And what emerged wasn't just similarity. It was repetition. Not exact, but close enough to feel intentional. The same structure. The same rhythm. The same progression. As if the second recording wasn't inspired by the first, but guided by it. As if something had been passed through time, unchanged, waiting to be followed again. And that meant one thing. The tape hadn't just been evidence. It had been instruction. A record of how it happens. How it should happen. And that realization reframed everything one final time. The tape had been placed. Not hidden. Not destroyed. Left where it could be found. Because it needed to be. Because it wasn't meant to disappear. It was meant to be heard. Learned. Repeated. They brought that to the first man. Laid it out clearly. The tape wasn't just a record, the detective said. It was a guide. A long silence. Then, a slight nod. The first true confirmation. You followed it, the detective continued. Another pause. And then, no. The word came softly. But it carried weight. Then what? The detective asked. And finally, the closest thing to an answer they would ever get. We didn't follow it, he said. We arrived at it. The distinction felt small. But it wasn't. Because following implies choice. Arrival implies inevitability. And that was the truth they had been circling the entire time. This wasn't something people chose to do. Not fully. Not consciously. It was something they stepped into. Something that was already there. Waiting. And once they were inside it, the roles took shape. The actions followed. The moment completed itself. The facility wasn't just a location. It was a point where that moment could happen. Where it had happened. Where it would happen again. Unless something changed that no one yet understood. Days passed. Then weeks. The case remained open, but its edges blurred. Charges were filed where they could be. Legal structures built around actions that, on paper, made sense. Trespassing. Kidnapping. Conspiracy. Words that fit. But didn't explain. The facility remained closed. Monitored. Watched. But watching didn't feel like enough anymore. Because they knew now. This didn't require that exact place. It didn't require those exact people. It only required the moment. And moments can happen anywhere. The tape was archived again. Both of them. Stored. Catalogued. Secured. But no one who had heard them believed they were contained. Because sound doesn't stay where it's placed. It lingers. It echoes. It waits. And somewhere, beyond the reports and the evidence and the fragile sense of resolution, something remained unresolved. Not the case. Something deeper. Something that had touched all of it without ever being fully seen. And as time moved forward, as life resumed its familiar rhythm, as the headlines faded and the urgency softened, there was one thought that never fully left. Not for the investigators. Not for the victim. Not for anyone who had stood in that room and felt what was there. This hadn't been the end of a cold case. It hadn't even been the solving of one. It had been something else entirely. A glimpse. A moment where something usually hidden had surfaced just long enough to be noticed. And then settled back into place. Waiting. Because whatever this was, it didn't begin in 1999. It didn't end here. And somewhere, at some point, in a place no one was watching yet, the same silence was forming. The same space was waiting. The same roles were empty. And when the moment came, when everything aligned again, there would be another voice. Another recording. Another point. And once again, no one would see it begin. Only hear it. After it was already over. They tried to seal it. Not just the doors, not just the perimeter, not just the physical structure of the facility, but the idea of it. The point. The place where something had happened twice, decades apart, in the same shape, the same rhythm, the same silence between sounds. Concrete barriers went up. Surveillance increased. Rotating patrols, motion sensors, thermal scans, everything that could be deployed was deployed. On paper, it was airtight. Controlled. Accounted for. But control is only meaningful when you understand what you're trying to contain. And they didn't. Days became weeks, and something unexpected began to settle over the case, not resolution, not even fatigue, but a kind of quiet distortion. Reports were filed, statements reviewed, timelines documented again and again until every second of that night, and the night in 1999, had been mapped in clinical detail. Yet the more complete it looked, the less it explained. Because everything they had built still relied on one assumption, that what they were dealing with followed rules they recognized. People. Intent. Cause and effect. But nothing about the case behaved that way anymore. The first man stopped requesting counsel. Stopped asking for anything at all. He ate when food was brought. Slept when the lights dimmed. Sat in stillness that didn't look like resignation, it looked like equilibrium. As if his part in something had concluded exactly the way it was meant to. The driver began to deteriorate, not outwardly, not in any dramatic sense, but in fragments. Answers that once came with hesitation now came with confusion. Not denial, genuine uncertainty. As if whatever they had learned wasn't fully theirs to understand. And the third remained unchanged. Days passed, and their demeanor didn't shift. No visible stress. No attempts to explain. No signs of regret or fear. Just presence. Calm. Centered. Like a fixed point in a moving system. That consistency became its own kind of alarm. Because people change under pressure. But roles don't. The investigators began revisiting something they had avoided before, not the evidence, not the timeline, but the experience. What it had felt like to be there. In the room. In the moment. In the presence of something that didn't align with anything they could categorize. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud. But eventually, someone did. It wasn't just them. Silence followed. Because everyone in that room understood what that meant. They had all felt it. Not seen. Not heard clearly. But there. A pressure. A shift in space. Something that made the air feel heavier, the silence feel structured. And now, removed from the immediacy of the event, that feeling didn't fade. It sharpened. They returned to the facility again, not to search, not to reconstruct, but to observe. To sit in the space without trying to force it into meaning. The room was empty. Completely. No chair now. Removed for evidence. No restraints. No recording devices. Just walls. Floor. Air. And yet, standing there, it didn't feel empty. One of the investigators walked the perimeter slowly, counting steps without realizing it. Another stood still, listening, not for sound, but for absence. Because absence had been the one constant across everything. And then, without planning it, one of them stopped. Mid-step. Turned slightly. And said, quietly, "Do you hear that?" No one answered. Because there was nothing to hear. And yet, they all paused. Not because of sound. Because of alignment. The space felt familiar. Not visually. Not physically. But structurally. Like something invisible had taken shape again. And for a brief moment, they understood something they hadn't before. The room didn't create the moment. It held it. Like a mold. Something that could be filled. Repeated. Reformed. And removing the objects, the chair, the restraints, the visible elements, hadn't changed that. Because those things had never been the point. They were just anchors. Markers. The real structure existed without them. That realization followed them back out. Into reports. Into conversations. Into the slow unraveling of certainty. Because if the place wasn't the source, then closing it changed nothing. Back at the station, something else began to shift. Not in the suspects. In the evidence. The recordings, both of them, had been analyzed extensively. Every frequency mapped. Every layer stripped apart and examined. There was nothing left to extract. Or so they thought. Until someone did something simple. They listened to it in reverse. Not as a trick. Not as a theory. Just as process. And what came out wasn't words. It wasn't hidden messages. It was structure. The rhythm didn't break. The pauses didn't collapse. It still held. Forward or backward, it worked. That shouldn't have been possible. Natural recordings degrade when reversed. Patterns distort. Timing loses coherence. But this didn't. Which meant it hadn't been captured naturally. It had been constructed to function both ways. Not just as a record, but as a form. Something that didn't depend on direction. Time didn't change it. That detail hit harder than anything before. Because it meant the moment wasn't tied to sequence. It could be entered from either side. Which meant the idea of before and after no longer held the same weight. And suddenly, the cycle didn't look like a loop. It looked like something suspended. Always accessible. Always waiting. They brought this back to the first man. Explained it. Carefully. Watched for reaction. And for the first time since his arrest, he seemed satisfied. Not relieved. Not pleased. But confirmed. You're starting to hear it, he said quietly. The phrasing again. Hear. Not understand. Not solve. Hear. Then tell us what it is, the detective said. A pause. And then. I can't. Not refusal. Limitation. Why not? A longer silence. And then. Because it doesn't stay the same when you say it. The answer didn't clarify anything. But it didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a boundary. Something that couldn't be translated without losing what it was. And that was the final shift. Because it meant they had reached the edge of what could be known through evidence, through interrogation, through logic. Everything beyond that was something else. The case didn't close. It couldn't. Not in any way that meant something had ended. It remained open, documented, active in the system. But in reality, it existed somewhere else now. In memory. In fragments. In the space between things that made sense and things that didn't. The facility stayed sealed. But not forgotten. The recording stayed archived. But not silent. And the people involved remained. Not as answers. As reminders. Because what had happened wasn't isolated. It wasn't contained. It wasn't finished. It had been seen. Heard. Interrupted. But not stopped. And somewhere. Not necessarily there. Not necessarily soon. But inevitably. The same structure would form again. The same silence. The same alignment. The same moment waiting to be filled. And when it did, there wouldn't be warning. There wouldn't be signs anyone recognized. There would only be the aftermath. Another recording. Another voice. Another point. And once again, the only thing anyone would know for certain is that it had already happened. They stopped calling it a case. Not officially. Not in reports, not in documentation, not in anything that required structure or closure. On paper, it remained exactly what it had always been, a criminal investigation spanning decades, now tied to multiple suspects, a recovered victim, and a sequence of events that could be described, categorized, and filed. But among the people who had stood inside that room, it stopped feeling like something that belonged to law enforcement. Because law enforcement depends on boundaries. On definitions. On the idea that something begins, unfolds, and ends. And this? Whatever this was. Refused all of it. The facility remained sealed, but something about that decision began to feel performative. Cameras watched empty corridors. Sensors monitored motion that never came. Logs filled with nothing, hours, days, weeks of absence recorded as if absence itself was evidence. And yet, the more they watched it, the more one question surfaced. What were they actually watching for? Movement? Sound? Presence? None of those had ever defined the moment. The moment had arrived without warning. Without deviation. Without anything that could be anticipated. And that made surveillance feel like a ritual instead of a safeguard. Still, they kept it in place. Because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Back at the station, the first man finally spoke again, unprompted this time. Not during interrogation. Not in response to a question. Just spoke. I remember the first time, he said quietly. The detective across from him didn't interrupt. Didn't guide it. Just let it happen. It wasn't there at first, he continued. Not like you think. It didn't feel like anything. Just a place. Just a room. His voice remained steady, but something underneath it shifted, not emotion, not quite, but depth. As if he were describing something that didn't fit into memory the way normal events do. And then it changed, he said. How? The detective asked. A pause. Not searching for words. Choosing them. It didn't add anything, he said. It took things away. Silence. Sound first, he continued. Not completely. Just enough that you notice the difference. Like something is missing, but you don't know what. The description settled heavily. Because it echoed something they had all felt. Not emptiness. Reduction. And then, he said, time. The word lingered. What about time? The detective asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Stops making sense, he said simply. The room felt smaller. Closer. Because that wasn't metaphor. It was recognition. You think you're moving forward, he added. But you're not. You're just arriving. The same word again. Arriving. Not choosing. Not deciding. Just reaching something that was already there. And the others, the detective asked. The people. A slight shift. They come in the same way, he said. Not together. Not planned. Just there when it's time. No hierarchy. No instruction. Just convergence. And the voice, the detective pressed. The one that isn't like the others. For the first time. He hesitated. Not out of resistance. Out of precision. That's the part you keep trying to name, he said quietly. Then what is it? A long silence. Then. It's the only thing that doesn't change. The answer landed with a kind of finality. Because everything else. The people. The roles. The structure. All of it shifted. But that remained. Unseen. Unidentified. Unmoved. The core of something that didn't belong to the same system as everything around it. The detective leaned back slightly, absorbing it. If it doesn't change, he said slowly, then it's always there. The man didn't respond immediately. But when he did. Yes. The word felt heavier than anything else he had said. Then why doesn't everyone experience it? Another pause. And then. They do. The answer came without hesitation. They just don't notice. That idea spread outward instantly. Not contained to the case. Not limited to the facility. If what he was saying was true, then this wasn't isolated. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even hidden. It was constant. Only rarely recognized. The implications were too large to process all at once. So they focused on what they could hold. The moment. The structure. The repetition. They returned to the recordings again, not for analysis, not for clues, but for understanding. They listened differently now. Not trying to extract meaning, but to experience the pattern the way it had been described. And something subtle shifted. Not in the audio. In them. The pauses felt longer. The spaces between sounds more defined. The breathing more present. As if the recording wasn't just something to be heard, but something to be entered. They stopped it. Immediately. Because something about that realization felt too close. Too personal. The line between observer and participant had already blurred enough. They didn't need to cross it. Back in the sealed facility, the monitoring logs recorded something unusual. Not movement. Not sound. A gap. A brief interruption in data. Less than a second. So small it would have been dismissed as a glitch in any other context. But here, nothing was dismissed anymore. They reviewed it. Frame by frame. Signal by signal. Everything cut cleanly for a fraction of a second. And then resumed. No distortion. No interference. Just absence. Perfect absence. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. The kind that feels placed. The timing didn't match anything obvious. No patrols nearby. No system changes. No environmental shifts. Just a moment. Gone. And then back. They cross-referenced it with everything else. Nothing aligned. No pattern. No repetition. Just a single point. A point that shouldn't exist. And yet, there it was. Logged. Documented. Real. They brought it to the first man. Showed him the timestamp. The interruption. Asked him what it meant. He looked at it for a long time. Longer than he had looked at anything else. And then, he smiled. Not widely. Not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But enough. It happened again, he said softly. The words chilled the room. What happened? The detective demanded. But he didn't answer. Not directly. He just leaned back slightly, eyes no longer focused on the present moment. It doesn't need the rest of it, he said. Not anymore. The implication hit hard. Because that meant the structure was changing. Evolving. Or maybe simplifying. You said it needs the moment, the detective pressed. The place. The people. A slight shake of the head. That's just how you saw it before. Before. The word echoed. As if something had shifted between then and now. As if the second event, the one they had interrupted, had changed the pattern itself. They left the room without another word. Because for the first time, it felt like they were behind again. Not catching up. Not closing in. Falling back. The case didn't expand after that. It deepened. In ways that couldn't be mapped. Couldn't be predicted. Couldn't be contained. Because whatever this was, it had been seen. Understood, partially. Interrupted, briefly. And now, it was no longer following the same structure. The facility remained sealed. The recordings remained archived. The people remained in custody. But the thing at the center of all of it, the one thing that didn't change, was no longer confined to any of those. And somewhere, in a space no one had marked, in a moment no one was watching, something aligned. Silence formed. Time bent just enough to go unnoticed. And for less than a second, it happened again. No room. No chair. No voices anyone could hear. Just the point. Existing. Waiting. Becoming something new. And disappearing. Before anyone knew it was there.